Sonic the Hedgehog is my favorite series. Back in middle school, I was actually, obsessed. Now, I don't blame you if you didn't know that, because the only way you could have known for sure based off my channel is this throwaway bit in my Kirby and the Forgotten Land video. It's pretty obvious on Twitter, but Twitter sucks, so I don't blame you for not following me. Please don't. Twitter sucks. But despite there being 3 major Sonic releases since I've started doing reviews, you may notice I don't actually have videos of them on my channel. These were all to do with different circumstances, and I'll put some kind of file, I don't know what it's going to be, or it's going to be video, audio, going over all of them in the description if you're curious. I would include them here, but this intro section of the video is going to be long enough as it is. My first game was Mania in August of 2017. I think it came out in July, but I played it the week after. Because I was still playing Mania when Forces came out, it wasn't a skill issue. I was just only allowed to play 30 minutes on weekends at the time. And it was a skill issue. These past few games have really only been the first Sonic hype cycles I've been a part of. But even in just these, we've had quite the spectrum. We have the game that never looks good, and, surprise, isn't good. I like Colors Ultimate, but it's not a good remaster at all. We have the game that looks bad initially, but then turns out pretty good. Not just decent, pretty good. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. That is a pretty good game. We got the game that looks amazing in marketing, but when it came out, it was still pretty good. It just had a couple of, noticeable flaws that Twitter seems to pick apart and calls it the worst Sonic game, one of the worst games ever because of that. What are we doing here, guys? And even a collection that seems impossible to fumble, it got fumbled somehow. And while those games that I said were pretty good are pretty good, there's just one little thing that holds them back from true greatness. That thing is budget and/or time. All these games felt undercooked. Colors Ultimate and Sonic Origins speak for themselves. Superstars had terrible boss design and poorly thought out multiplayer. And even disregarding Frontier's janky movement, dull animation, and pop-in, there's a noticeable drop-off around Chaos Island where you start getting 10 times more 2D sections, and then the other islands in the game after that are just part of the first island that got separated from it. So it's very clear they ran out of budget, and it's very visible in the game when that happened. So when it first got leaked that Sonic Generations was going to get a remaster that added new content based on Shadow, I didn't know what to feel. Frankly, I was a little worried. Generations was my favorite 3D game, and in my head it frequently contested Mania as my overall favorite. I was scared that a rushed remaster cash grab would permanently tarnish its reputation, something Colors still hasn't recovered from. And at first I honestly thought Shadow was just going to be a skin, or it would be equivalent to the 15-minute long episode Shadow DLC for Sonic Forces. The first trailer during that January State of Play immediately expelled almost all of these concerns. Not only was Sonic Generations seemingly untouched, making its legacy intact, but the Shadow portion looks like this? Why are the animations so good? And any lingering doubts I may have had about the level design were gotten rid of by the second trailer at Summer Games Fest later that year, and a demo that occurred at the event. And the game only got better with every trailer. Not once did any red flags emerge from all of the fan base. I mean, some people were saying that early on that it was Forces level design, but that got as soon as Kingdom Valley was shown off, everyone who was saying that went silent. I think this graphic created by the Sonic social media team shortly after the review embargo lifted sums it up perfectly. Honestly, throughout the cycle, my main concern wasn't even if the game was going to be good or not. It was, how am I going to play this thing? Whilst initially not thought to be the case, after seeing how small my dorm was going to be, it became apparent that I would not be allowed to bring my desktop computer to college. Buying a Steam Deck was just unfeasible financially, even though I tried. I'm going to have to buy a Switch 2 next year anyway, and buying 2 consoles in such a succession is possibly the worst thing one could do with their money. And I didn't even consider the normal Switch as an option until after I'd already left it at home. With that in mind, I'd like to give a special shout out to my roommate for letting me use his Xbox. And to God for sending me a roommate that has an Xbox. There are several alternate timelines where I don't get to play this game on launch, and I am so glad this is not one of them. While we're giving shoutouts to the commenter last time who said that this mic actually address it from the end and not the side. I probably looked like an idiot. I apologize for that. Before we get to the meat of this video and the Shadow campaign, let's briefly touch on Sonic Generations since it's important to understanding Shadow Gens, and I need you guys to play that game too. So, in Sonic Generations, Sonic and his friends are celebrating Sonic's 20th birthday when a cloudy monster called the Time Eater waltzes in and completely rips apart the timeline. Just utterly destroys it. Completely annihilates time as we know it. Just demolished. Sonic wakes up in white space, a place where no time exists. but soon figures out that by going fast through these colorless levels, he can restore the timeline. So he joins up with a younger version of himself from the Genesis games in order to stop the time meter and save the literal entire fabric of reality. It's crazy how lighthearted the story in this game is because the stakes are arguably the highest they've ever been. The game is structured in the 3 eras: the Genesis games, the adventure games, and the, at the time, modern games. Each era has 3 stages with 2 acts each, one for classic Sonic and one for modern Sonic, one main boss, one rival fight, and several challenge stages per zone, which add existing level design to make something new. The challenges are not always super enjoyable, but you only have to beat one of them in every zone to beat the game, so I'm fine with them. While the classic stages are fun enough, they aren't very similar to his past appearances. He controls the same, but the physics and level design are so different to the point where I almost can't even call this the same gameplay style. Again though, it was a nice throwback at the time when there was nothing like it, and I found the stages to be more fun than I remember when replaying the game for this review. The real star of the show here is Modern Sonic. This is the boost gameplay perfected. For the unfamiliar, in this style of game, you have this meter, and at any time you can press X, or I guess RT in this version, to activate your boost, which allows you to go really fast and plow through enemies until the meter runs out. It's not like a limited time power-up that's hard to refill. Every enemy that you defeat and ring you collect gives you more boosts, so once you get really good at the game like me, you can almost never run out. Actually, I don't think I did run out during this replay. And this gameplay style is incredibly fun, constantly running through everything, quickly reacting to incoming obstacles to stay on the fastest route, tightly drifting around turns. It's a very high skill ceiling and endlessly replayable. Generations was the only Sonic game where I really grinded the time trials. I know that's kind of the point of every game, but that part really never interested me. That just speaks volumes about how well Generations controls and why it's easily my favorite 3D game. It's tied up Mania in my head right now for the best one, and I constantly go back and forth on which is actually better. It honestly depends on the day. Let me also briefly talk about the changes in this remaster. They added the drop dash for both characters, although for Modern Sonic it's very clunky to use and doesn't really add anything to the game. For Classic it's janky, it doesn't work well with the level design as it does in other Classic games, and it's a skill for some reason, which is not on Modern Sonic. That's kind of weird. They added some Chao you can find as optional collectibles, they rewrote some of the cutscenes, and that's it. Yeah, this is not a remaster. It's essentially just an upscale port. Now to be clear, I don't think it needed to be. Generations is still a great looking game, even for today's standards, and I don't really know what they could have done to make it better without completely remaking it. I just don't like that Sega is calling it a remaster in the marketing when it clearly isn't. Like, the 3D World Switch port never called itself a remaster. But just like that 3D World port, the port of the game is only half the story. There's also an entirely new game here in the form of Shadow Generations. Considering Sonic Gens is one of my favorite games of all time, I'll be referring to that as Base Gens throughout the rest of the video, Shadow Gens had some really big shoes to fill. Shoes so big that, despite how good the trailers looked, there was a small part of me that thought it was going to be a disappointment again. I figured there would be some kind of catch, like maybe the Act 2 of every level was entirely 2D, and said 2D would be dreadful. Or maybe the open zone was confusing to navigate. I should stress, though, that it was only a small part of me. Mostly, I sat in my room on my bed on my phone, watching Choctopus's demo footage and the Metal Overlord B-roll over and over, saying to myself, this game is going to be so good, man. But guess what happened? Shadow walked up to those absolutely massive shoes Jen's behind, and had to sell them because they were too small. Please don't make fan art of that. That was just a big shoes to fill metaphor. Please do not draw that. Stop, Apple! Jeez, stop! So whilst investigating an anomaly detected on a space colony arc where Shadow was born, he finds that somehow Black Doom has returned, despite his defeat in Shadow the Hedgehog, and he now has the power to recreate his favorite stage, Radical Highway from Sonic Adventure 2 for the Dreamcast, in his own image. After making it through and getting a hit off on him, the Time Meteor appears, setting off the events of Generations. But because Shadow was not at Sonic's birthday party, he gets sent to a different part of White Space. He now has to speed through his past and his future in order to power up with the eventual goal of defeating Black Doom. The story doesn't really go beyond that, aside from Maria and Gerald's appearances, but it doesn't matter too much. If you're a fan, be sure to talk to all the NPCs in the hub after you beat every level though, as they will have new dialogue every time, and some dialogue will be unreadable after you beat the next one. There's a lot of lore tidbits in here, so again, I highly recommend going for these if you're a fan. I mentioned White Space was different a few seconds ago, didn't I? Well, in Base Gens, White Space is represented as a 2D level with not much depth. It's a pretty bare-bones level select with not much to do besides that. In Shadow Generations, White Space is an open world inspired by Frontiers, albeit not nearly as big as the islands in that game. There's lots of collectibles to find, missions to do, which kind of remind me of the visions in Sonic Jam Subworld, and chests to open. Pretty much all of these reward you with concept art and music from the series, like Base Gens does. Except in that game, getting them was a lot less interesting. Every time you would collect a red star ring in a level, a text-only pop-up would appear saying, "You got it," but that's it. The bonus bells from the challenges were a little better, but retrieving the note was still super easy in 2D. Here, the levels can give you bottle caps, gears, which you can use to unlock chests in the hub world. And once you do, an image pops up with the text to actually show you what you got. The bonus bells also return, but here they're inherently more interesting because you're in 3D now. Some also require out-of-the-box thinking. Like, what do you mean I have to get there in 20 seconds? What? Overall, collecting art and music in this game is much more satisfying than in base gens, and this hub world is very fun to explore and do all the collectibles. I just wish the pause screen map was a bit better. Like, the zoom in is bare bones, you can't pan it at all, and the machine parts are not displayed even when you have almost all of them, so you would have to mindlessly wander until you find the last 3 you need. I feel bad for all the Sonic streamers having to do this right now. I am happy to report, though, that they fixed the pop-in. Unlike Frontiers, where you cannot see where you have to go until you get like 5 feet in front of it, the only reason I knew there was pop-in was because I looked at a platform I knew a collectible was on from a distance, and I found that the collectible just wasn't there anymore. But you don't actually see it pop in or anything. It's unnoticeable in normal gameplay, unless you're, like, look at stuff from a distance. Okay, let's talk about the physics and controls next, since that's super important. There's been a huge problem with the controls in the past few Boost games, due to them often using the previous game as a base. So Lost World was built off of Gens, Force was built off of Lost World, even though those games are nothing alike, and Frontiers was built off of Forces. While not an inherently bad thing on its own, the controls were not properly tuned afterwards, making the physics worse each time. It's like a game of telephone. And you could really see this in the cyberspace levels of Frontiers, where Sonic somehow felt too heavy and too light at the same time. It's really hard to describe, but it certainly didn't feel good to play. Thankfully, the controls were different in the open zone, but the cyberspace stages were a chore for the most part because of these terrible physics. Well, I'm happy to report that, while Shadow Gens is built off of Frontiers, they really spent time fine-tuning the movement here. It feels great! It's so silky smooth that it might even be better than base gens. I've seen lots of people saying that Shadow's movement made the OG look tanky by comparison. While I did not feel that way, it's only because I've played the game recently enough to still have all the muscle memory and understand the movement quirks. I will say, it is very nice that you keep most of your momentum in a jump now, as opposed to gens where it would just kill it most of the time. Shadow also stops on a dime on default. You can change this in the options. Oh, I didn't think that would be a good change at first. I ended up loving it. 2 minor complaints, there's no drift button, and the quick step feels a little weird for some reason. Okay, update. Apparently the quick step in this game is just step. Meaning you can actually hold the button down to constantly step in that direction. I had to learn this from Twitter. The game technically teaches you here, but because it was in this tunnel, I thought it was in a contextual action, like how he slides down the buildings. So to sum up, Shadow controls like a dream. But his moveset goes beyond what was found in base gens. Shadow has access to a whole new suite of abilities. First of all, Shadow retains his iconic ability, Chaos Control, which allows him to freeze time for a few seconds. This is frequently used in extremely clever ways to access alternate paths. Like in Rail Canyon from Sonic Heroes, there are these badniks from the original game that destroy parts of the rails, and in any other game this would just be a set piece and nothing more. But if you use Chaos Control before they destroy them, you can actually ride on that rail and access a shortcut. Or in this part from Sunset Heights, from Sonic Forces, yes, they really went there. There's this very obvious alternate path, but no platforms or anything. I was like, how do I get up there? I thought about it for the rest of the level, and eventually realized what you do. I was like, hey, wait a second. There's this Death Egg robot in the back that's constantly throwing rocks at you. I wonder.
This is the ultimate power.
To that end, they absolutely cooked with the level design here. There are so many branching paths, it feels like there's always a shortcut you could have taken, no matter where you are in the level. Most of these are just small shortcuts that put you back on the main path, but it's still great. And the level design is much better in a crucial area, the structure. The acts follow a similar-ish structure to base gens, where one act is a 3D level and one act is 2D. However, first of all, Classic Sonic's gone, that's good. Second of all, the 3D acts are entirely in 3D. If you're not a Sonic fan, you might say, well, what's the big deal? Isn't that normal for a 3D game? Not for this series. Previous Boost games, like base gens, relied heavily on 2D sections to solve a length problem. This was necessary because Boost Sonic went so fast, it was too expensive for him to just let him run forward the whole time. They would spend hours carefully crafting this massive level, and then Sonic would run through it in like 30 seconds. This is why these games are always short, by the way. So in order to increase runtime to acceptable levels for a fully priced retail game, Boost Sonic would often spend a lot of time in 2D sections, which would cut down on the speed a bit and focus more on platforming. I think Forces had some exclusively 3D levels, but they were always 1 to 2 minutes long. The levels in this game are upwards of 5 minutes. Again, that doesn't sound like a big deal if you're not a fan, but this is long. Trust me. And guess what? Remember how I said that the 2D sections were annoying because you had to focus more on platforming? Well, I don't know what they did, but the 2D levels in this game are just as fun as the 3D ones. There's still constant speed, multiple paths, and plenty of 2.5D shenanigans that sometimes make you forget this is a 2D level. I honestly don't know how they did this. They made 2D Pooh Sonic fun, like... Wow. Just wow. No words. Like, insane. I actually didn't know they could do that. I thought this format would never work in 2D. The challenges from base gens also return, and these are fun as well. Insane, man. So yeah, the level design in this game is sublime. Constant shortcuts to find, fun and interesting uses for the Doom powers, and the pace never breaks for a second. The best 2 levels in this game are from 2 of the worst games in the series. I mean, the game has to be doing something right if it can make fans excited over a level from a game we all despise. And look how good these look! We finally have a Sonic game that looks like a fully fledged AAA next-gen title. I suppose Forces looks pretty good too, and the lighting actually may have been better in that game. Look at these animations! It feels like every 5 minutes in this game, Shadow will do just the coolest thing ever. Like destroying a missile with punches and kicking it backwards, or grinding on the arm of a giant robot in motion. These animations really stand out in the Radical Highway segments.
Shadow, I just love Radical Highway. Watch this building turn around in on itself. Isn't that cool, Shadow? Sure you want to join me now?
This is what Infinite's levels should have looked like in Forces. Speaking of Infinite, he's not in this game. Never mind, it's a 0 out of 10. This game sucks. Anyway, going back to the Doom powers I teased like at the beginning of this review, they are all context sensitive. You can only Doom Blast the black arms, you can only surf when there's water to surf on. But I think this really works in the game's favor, as opposed to having a gimmick that just completely stops your flow like the Wisps. And I like the Wisps. You can just keep moving the whole time. Everything is super seamless. The only one that's not as good is Doom Morph, because I don't think the game does a very good job tutorializing it. It took me a while to figure out what the distance between launching from the balls and grappling from them was. In fact, I didn't even know until after I wrote that part. I found it out on a Twitter post someone made with this graphic. Essentially, if you let go of the button at the very bottom of the morph ball, you will launch through the top. Once you realize this, the form becomes just as fun as all the other ones. It's just a skill check. So yeah, Shadow Generations is absolutely amazing in every aspect. It's not a step in the right direction like the past few games have been. No, it's legitimately a contender for the best game in the series. I am not joking. Right now, Mania, Sonic Gens, and Shadow Gens are all battling out in my head for that title. And guess what? 2 of those are in the same package, so buying this should be a no-brainer. It's not even a $70 game, it's only $50. And although the first game was $20 on Steam in recent years, the game retailed for $50 at launch. So you're basically getting an entirely free game here. If you like platformers at all, and chances are, if you watch this channel, you do, then please buy this game. It's probably going to be my game of the year, which is saying a lot because Anton Blast is about to come out. Like, I never thought this would be the better game. I always thought this would be like a good game, but that Anton Blast was going to blow it out of the water. What timeline are we in? This game is proof enough that Sonic Team is still more than capable of putting out bangers. All they need is the proper resources. If Sega and Sammy can keep investing in them, and chances are they will, because this game sold 1 million copies by launch day, the future of the franchise looks bright. We have never been more back. Seriously though, please put Infinite in new games, Sega. It's not fair. You made the coolest design and voice acting possible, but then you trapped him in a game with some of the worst writing in the